Personal relationship with divinity is probably one of the most loaded phrases you'll ever hear in modern spirituality. But don't worry, the heathen answer, particularly the radical one, is nowhere near as scary as the personal relationship most people probably think of when they hear that phrase. If there is one thing that could be said to be the central element of polytheistic and animistic practice, it is relationship. Relationship with self, relationship with place, relationship with the powers and the greater forces that shape reality. Unfortunately, this core concept of relationship, particularly when it involves gods, can set off alarm bells for newer practitioners and curious seekers alike. I personally think the reason for this is thanks to the most widely known, publicized, and visible form of spiritual practice that emphasizes personal relationship with different powers and with deity. I'm talking, of course, about evangelical Christianity. This, however, is not the only way that relationships can work between practitioners and gods. In fact, heathenry in general, in part because our polytheistic, somewhat animistic deities are quite flawed, make mistakes, and arguably, as I discuss at greater length in the Ragnarok episode, are the architects of their own downfall in the doom of the powers. This stands in contrast with the all-knowing, all-loving, all-forgiving, perfect, and all-powerful God that Jesus is a representative, aspect, portion. I'm not going to try to get into Christology. When we covered that in history, particularly in like medieval and ancient history, it always made my head spin. So, leaving that aside, the more human qualities of the gods of heathenry mean relationships with them are much more, well, human. In this episode, I'm going to get more into what this means and break down how relationships between practitioners and gods works in radical heathen practice, along with covering some other general tendencies you will see in heathen spaces when discussing this subject. Before I really dive in, I do want to say up front that it is perfectly possible and quite valid for someone to engage in heathen spiritual practice without really having anything at all to do with the gods, or even taking a perspective that more sees them as figures of myth and inspiration than necessarily literal, otherworldly intelligences. A thing that's interesting about heathenry generally, but particularly when we're talking about gods, is, again, it is a practice that you do. It is not something that is valid because you believe it is true. It is valid because the practices and the comfort and support and guidance they offer you are meaningful to you and add value to your life. Now, how I'm going to do this is I'm first going to discuss the concept of fulltrui, an Old Nordic word that is commonly used in heathen practice and tends to show up a lot in the source material for describing relationships with gods and what its significance is for modern practitioners. I'm then going to get into the really fun topic of talking back to gods, something that actually seems to be a thing in the source material, and is part of that whole thing of these gods are much more human, much more approachable, and flawed. I will then get into how this understanding of relationship with deity is very different from the tendencies you often see in Christian-influenced spiritual practice. One thing I'm also going to get into are some certain warning signs to watch out for. There are some assumptions and perspectives about deity that have been held over, brought into, inherited by folks who are in pagan spaces that draw from much more authoritarian and top-down understandings, and that's something I think needs to particularly be addressed. I'll then wrap things up, touch on the main points, and close things out. To start is the word fultrui. Now, fultrui is a term that is often translated to mean something along the lines of friend, dear trusted one, and other similar kinds of meanings. Not unlike the Arabic habibi, often translated as dear one, but usually used in explicitly religious contexts. In this context, what it seems to indicate is a bond between specific individuals mentioned in the sagas and the gods in terms of a deep, profound friendship. This is something that's important to get into because this is different from the term you generally tend to see in broader pagan spaces of patron deities, something that implies a certain hierarchical relationship at times and also harkens back to this concept of patronage, which, again, is something that has particular connotations of someone who has greater resources lending support to another who does different works and such on their behalf. Fultrui has implications as something that, while not strictly speaking equal in all ways, and certainly not in the source materials, is a bit less lopsided, and something that involves more of a sense of reciprocity and relationship than necessarily power and subservience. This linguistic evidence gives us an idea of how these kinds of relationships may have been perceived, at least within the source materials that survive to present day. Suggests this is not just a question of preferred terminology being applied in a specific context, but may indeed reflect something deeper. The first place that we'll go is the Landnámabók, or the Book of Settlements, from the Icelandic sagas. This is the poem that describes the first Nordic families who settled in Iceland. Of course, there's also a brief mention in passing of the thralls they brought along with them, and we know there were quite a few people taken into thraldom for the settlement of Iceland. By the names of each of these different individuals that are listed, it also notes whether or not they were devoted to particular gods. And there are a few who are explicitly stated to not be keeping any gods in particular. Another saga that adds more depth to this expression is the saga of Hrafnkel Freysgode. The saga's main narrative describes a man known as Hrafnkel, who begins the saga as a devotee of the Vanir Freyr, who hosts feasts and sacrifices and other spiritual practices related to Freyr in his hall and on his land. To summarize things a little briefly, as you could say, in some ways, the saga of Hrafnkel mirrors the Book of Job. Hrafnkel undergoes a series of misfortunes and setbacks in his life that ultimately lead to him ending his devotion and relationship with Freyr. In Hrafnkel's eyes, this is justified because, as he saw it, Freyr did not provide the support and protection he needed at vital moments in his life. However, it is important to note that in the saga, Hrafnkel does not then say, therefore, these gods do not exist. He simply forswears the god that he once held to. Not unlike, potentially, the people listed in the Book of Settlements, who are described as keeping no gods in particular. So, what does this mean for modern practitioners? I think what these sources suggest is a view of deity where the gods are not necessarily infallible if they fail to uphold their end of any particular relationship. The relationship itself can be rendered null and void. And humans have a considerable amount of agency to walk away from them without any particular evidence of this carrying specific kind of ill fortune or ill will. In fact, this isn't just in these two sources. Quite frequently, you will see the expression in the Nordic sagas, although again, we should take this with some grain of salt because of who the audience was and the time of when these were composed, but nonetheless, you do regularly see the expression, trusted not in the strength of gods, but in their own sword arm. Now, keeping in mind, these sagas that use this expression the most were commissioned by the feudal warrior aristocracy that now ruled in Scandinavia, and I'm sure there's a certain little macho tickle that comes from someone boasting they need no cosmic or deific aid, and they are mighty enough on their own. But nonetheless, what these all suggest is it's perfectly possible for people not even to be in relationship with gods and still be engaging in broader practice. It also suggests that these relationships between individuals and gods are ones that are, well, like those of trusted friends. And if there's a friend who abandons you or does not help you in your direst need, then it makes sense to reevaluate that relationship. Now, this is not a question of quid pro quo. There's no sense anywhere, at least from what I've seen, in the source material of the relationship being transactional in a way. There isn't this feeling of, I provide blood offerings and godly benefits come out like it's some kind of slot machine. There also isn't any kind of prosperity gospel kind of notion going on of, if I am wealthy and prosperous, it is because I enjoy the favor of the gods. Remember, this is the same body of myth that includes zingers like Havamal 77, which says, full-stocked folds had the fatling's sons, who now bear a beggar's staff. Brief is wealth as the winking of an eye, most faithless ever of friends. Bellows translation. And on that subject, the Havamal goes on at great length about friendship, as well as things like hospitality and magic and lots of other stuff. And the way it describes friendship is as a continuous reciprocal exchange of gifts and support and assistance, and it is something expressed in deeds that are done. Nothing better summarizes how non-transactional this attitude is than verse 52, which reads, "Not great things alone must one give to another, praised oft is earned from naught, with half a loaf and a tilted bowl. I have found me many a friend." Which again emphasizes it's not the price tag that matters, it's the action and what it conveys. To turn more towards my personal experience and what I have seen in the Fire and Ice community, it is very accepted when entering into relationship with gods to lay down clear terms and boundaries. And one of the biggest reasons for this is because even though our gods are flawed, limited, polytheistic, will eventually die in the fires of the end of this world and the beginning of the new one, they are still gods. These are still the beings who collectively spun physical reality up from the body of a great giant, who lit the stars in the heavens, formed the planets, and injected the possibility of multicellular life into the primordial ooze. They are also, it must be said, not human. They have not lived the lives that we do or deal with the particular challenges that we have. Though I think that they have their own limitations and shortcomings, makes them more sympathetic to an extent to the struggles that we face and able to empathize in a genuinely compassionate manner. They still, nonetheless, don't necessarily have the same perception of time as we do, don't have the same understanding of limits, and it is also important when establishing these kinds of relationships to explain where it is you are and what it is you can do. Some gods who are especially notorious for defying boundaries, like Loki and Odin, are ones who are seen as needing especially strong and clear boundaries. Having a healthy sense of boundaries is incredibly important in developing sustaining and sustainable relationships with the deific powers in Fire and Ice or radical practice. One thing that I recommend in the way of Fire and Ice, and also recommend for anyone who's wanting to get started in relationships with gods, or even is considering an oath to a god, that you approach it, at least initially, like you are laying out terms of a contract. An oath, after all, is sort of a legally binding contract in a way, so it makes sense to be clear about specific terms and provisions. And it's also perfectly okay to renegotiate and redefine things as things move along. So after all, we change and grow and develop over time, and I'm sure beings like the gods we work with likely do as well. After all, things that are imperfect and limited in scope have a need to change with the times and conditions they are facing. Odin, for example, absolutely changes in terms of the kind of figure that he is in source material, beginning as one of three, rising up against the central power of all of reality, and then pushing the boundaries of knowledge, creating and doing things. And then by the time we get to things like the death of Balder and the Völuspá, this is an Odin that is much more in a place of preserving and maintaining what has been created. This is not the bright culture hero who rose up and redistributed resources and information. This is someone who is now seeing the twilight days of their work is coming and are working to sustain that as long as possible. Now, at this point, it is important to get into the particularly, I guess you could say, sticky stuff around what this means in modern practice. Simply put, when anyone can potentially have a relationship with any of the gods, potentially all of them, some, none, certain groups, whatever combination you like, it sort of takes a bit of the air out of the proverbial aspiring prophet balloon. This, by the way, is not just a question of personal interpretation. There is some suggestion within the source material based on the lack of any kind of figure claiming to be the spokesperson for any particular god, the paramount authority who could pronounce rulings and statements. Like, there's nothing, for example, like, say, the collegia that you see attached to specific deities in the Roman Empire. There's nothing like, say, the Pontifex Maximus or the prophets of the Old Testament, or, for that matter, saints talking to and receiving messages from gods. Doesn't seem to have been something that was particularly special. Now, I'm not going to say it was necessarily normal. There is quite a bit of evidence to suggest that the powers that pre-conversion practitioners interacted most often with were the animistic powers of place and space that they were in relationship with. And certainly there is a strong trend in this direction in modern heathen practice as well. But nonetheless, there doesn't seem to be anything like, I have a message from Thor, or anything similar in the source material. And that attitude didn't really seem to exist. Now, there are certainly specific chronicles, like, say, the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle or the Heimskringla, where kings claim descent from ancient gods. And there are some, like Rune Rasmussen, who have argued this is evidence of a concept of continuous cosmology. And generally speaking, I think this is broadly true. After all, there doesn't seem to be anything that's stopping anyone from conversing with the gods, the dead, or other various powers. Even if they can't do it directly, they can at least seek out the aid of a Seidh worker or a seer who is more skilled in such arts. But in this particular case, based on when these claims of divine ancestry are emerging, it is also possible this is a little bit of medieval warlords going, well, I'm descended from special people, so therefore I'm more special than you. This is not to say such ideas did not exist for the pre-conversion Nordic peoples. It is certainly within the realm of possibility. I'd even say probability in some cases, especially because, the Greeks and the Romans are right over there, and they have a very robust tradition of mortals who have divine parentage running around. Julius Caesar, for example, claimed to be the son of Venus, as was tradition within his particular house, the Julii. But that said, there isn't any sense of these particular people speak on behalf of the gods, therefore they're receiving messages from the gods, so therefore they have special and higher spiritual authority than other people do. Now, there certainly are modern people who try to do that and make that claim. But that is something that I don't think there's historical support for, and more importantly, seems to draw much more from the Christian tradition of where people who are touched by God are as specially important and especially honored and revered for their piety, their devotion, and being especially in tune with the will of God, whatever that should be. I mean, the Catholic Church literally institutionalizes this in the form of the office of the papacy. There's also other Christian denominations like Pentecostals and specifically the New Apostolic Reformation who have the office of modern prophets, of people who are said to prophesy and speak the will of God. I strongly suspect this particular cultural legacy is a significant factor in why a lot of mental health workers, though certainly not all, but quite a lot in the United States, Canada, and other predominantly Christian parts of the world, will treat hearing the words of divinity as a sign of mental illness, which, by the way, just going to put that out there to anyone listening. If you're not sure about your therapist on this particular question, you don't want to wind up involuntarily committed for spiritual reasons. This is a thing that has happened, and I'm not just talking in terms of friend of a friend stuff, like people I personally know have been threatened with involuntary commitment for being pagans or witches of any kind. I'm not saying don't talk about your spirituality with your therapist. I'm saying be careful and work carefully in that area. To put it bluntly, you don't want to find out the hard way that the person you've been seeing for the past 6 months thinks that Michelle Remembers is an authoritative account of satanic ritual abuse. Now, all that said, if someone is using their relationship with deity as a claim to authority, you should treat that as a red flag the size of a football pitch. Simply put, no one person or people are an especially informed authority on what the gods want and think. And even what we understand of what's communicated by them is its own complicated mess, because not everybody perceives or understands it in the same way. Some folks tend to receive or interact with their particular gods through things like omens and divination. Others through intense trance work. Others, it's much more intellectual and philosophical than it is literal. This is before even getting to the whole thing of how do you communicate with powers that are associated with significant aspects of reality, core concepts in society, and probably have an understanding of the material and biological sciences that would leave us feeling like ants, and understand that in a literal sort of one-to-one kind of way. Someone sharing their experiences with particular gods in sort of a, well, this is what I experienced, and this is what I saw, and I've felt, and I understand, is a thing you will see a lot. And that's perfectly okay. Because that's people sharing their particular perspectives on a vast and complex subject matter. When somebody, however, steps forward and says, well, XYZ God is this, and this is what they say, or what is indisputably true, and you must do so as I say, that's not somebody who's speaking with any authority beyond what they can claim onto themselves, and whoever they can persuade that they actually have that authority. Though I do have to say, from a spiritual and ethical perspective, such claims should be challenged the moment they emerge. Because after all, if we are in a polytheistic, animistic form of spirituality where anyone can communicate with deity, then how can any one or small group claim to have special, higher knowledge than anyone else? This gets me to the topic of talking back to gods. If we accept that gods are fallible, flawed, and limited, in contrast to the all-powerful, all-knowing, perfect Christian God, then, therefore, it is okay to disagree with and even talk back to them. I mean, maybe you don't want to, say, tempt Thor into dropping his hammer on your head, but you can push back. You can say no, and you can say, that's not something I want to do. The Saga of Hrafnkel, for example, is an extended example of somebody finally saying, you know what, I'm going to say no. This relationship does not work anymore, and I am ending it. There's also examples in the Völuspá and the Balderdrama, both in the Poetic Edda, of specific figures interacting with Odin and giving him quite a bit of sass. Both these sagas feature a figure who I refer to in The Way of Fire and Ice as the Nameless Cirrus, who may or may not be the same figure. I've personally interpreted them to be the same figure, because after all, how many dead ancient Cirruses are there that Odin would take the time to summon out of the grave and compel for answers on the future? But I digress. In each case, the Nameless Cirrus is a dead vulva of some kind or another. It's not clear if they're human or Jotun or something else, who is summoned not voluntarily by Odin from beneath the mound where they are buried. Odin then forces them to give him answers to questions that are burning in his mind. In the case of the Balderdrama, horrific nightmares that plague his son Balder. And in the case of the Völuspá, what fate awaits the gods? In both cases, the Nameless Cirrus sinks barbs back at Odin. She taunts him, particularly in the Völuspá, with the repeated refrain, "Would you know more?" And clearly, there are even limits to Odin's magic, as shown by the Cirrus closing off both conversations, particularly the Völuspá, with the declaration of, "But now I must sink," as she returns to her ultimate resting place. In modern practice, the same is somewhat true. Though I haven't met anyone who gives the levels of sass that, say, the Nameless Cirrus does to Odin in the Völuspá, I nonetheless know from my experience, as well as from the experiences of others that I've worked with over the years, that it is quite normal to say no and to push back on what the gods are demanding, offering, or requesting. The root of this is the simple truth that exists around all heathen gods, which is to say, just because a god does something does not make it morally right. This also, by the way, strongly argues that just because someone says a god told them to do something does not make that something right either. Now, oftentimes, what the gods will put forward to practitioners are things that, as long as you're clear about things like boundaries and ethics and stuff like that, are within the bounds of what you would consider to be acceptable. You're certainly not likely to be receiving messages about having to do indiscriminate or unjustified harm to people just because. And by the way, if someone you know is making those claims, please seek help. That is not something that should be treated as a spiritual revelation, but as a cry for an intervention. But all in all, what this core assumption and this core logic means is that heathen practitioners have room to push back. They have room to disagree, because right and wrong in heathenry is defined by the impact and consequences of your deeds, and not whether or not something is intrinsically right or wrong in and of itself. Though, it must be said, there is a streak of defying the odds and defying the inevitable in what stands before you in heathen practice that must always be considered. Either way, what this means is a godly message is not necessarily a must. It is not necessarily something that must always be obeyed and adhered to. It is certainly something that there's also room for interpretation and understanding, since after all, as I've already gotten into earlier, the way that people understand their communications with the powers varies considerably and is filtered through things like symbol and metaphor and indirect reference as opposed to literal message. So it's quite likely what you're going to be getting is more in the direction of guidance and advice than necessarily strict thou must or thou must not. I'd actually say it's very rare for something like that and something that clear to come through, and those are moments to pay attention to, but to also discuss and unpack with other people, and not simply take as, well, this is divine writ, so therefore I must do it. Or, by the same token, if someone else says this is divine writ and we must do it, it is perfectly okay. In fact, I would say it's very encouraged to push back and say, well, really, let's unpack that a bit more. Let's talk about that. What does that mean? It also has to be said that there's not particular groups or individuals within the heathen pantheon, such as it is, that could be seen as the ultimate source of rightness or wrongness. Totally absent, at least within the heathen space, is divine conflict that is driven by forces being intrinsically at odds with one another. There are no angels versus demons, heaven versus hell. We must struggle on behalf of the gods to delay Ragnarok by struggling with the servants of their enemies, kind of thing. And quite honestly, anyone who is injecting that into heathen practice is taking a lot more from the Left Behind books than anything that's in the source material. And also probably throwing in a dash of Buffy the Vampire Slayer for good measure. If it could be said that there are forces to struggle against on a grand cosmic level, they are the forces that are the manifestations and consequences of very real people in this world acting in their own particular interests or for their own particular reasons that cause harm to other people. In short, evil is not a curse visited by the divine, if that word is even appropriate here. It is something that is the consequence of deliberate and conscious action. And some of the greatest evils in this world today aren't because specific Jotun are running amok, but because of the damage and harm that people have done. Something that is, in a lot of ways, strongly suggested in the Voluspa, where the first event that brings in Ragnarok, following the crowing of the three roosters, is humanity turning upon itself in a war of all against all. If there are powers like Nidhogg who seek to devour and undermine existence, then it seems, at least based on what is in the source material, and in my view, that the best way to hold back such forces is to fix things in the here and now, rather than seeking cosmic scapegoats or excuses to victimize those for things that are part of who they are. So, to wrap things up, summarize, and close this out, in heathenry, Your relationship with the gods is always subject to change, and you have agency to assert your comfort level, your boundaries, and what it is you are and are not prepared to do. There is no special significance of someone having communications with the gods. I wouldn't say it's a normal everyday thing, but it certainly isn't on the level of anyone who does is inherently granted with special authority over those who do not. In fact, that one can choose to practice without having relationships with any of the gods argues pretty strongly that claiming such authority has no real basis in source material or much of accepted modern practice, and certainly not in radical practice. That the gods are themselves figures who are fallible, subject to change, and not all-seeing and all-knowing makes them more approachable, makes them more understandable, and certainly less intimidating than a deity who describes human beings as dust motes beneath the wheels of their chariot. How you understand the gods and how other people do is always going to vary. And for every heathen that you ask for their opinion on the gods, you're going to get 3 or 4 answers that are probably equally valid and may seem almost contradictory, except not, and how they unify competing tensions. After all, as we contain multitudes, so do the greater powers. Finally, I want to again emphasize the importance of setting healthy boundaries and being clear in your communications and workings with gods of what it is you can and cannot do, what it is that is too much for you, and what it is that you are prepared to do. Even though they are gods, as the term full trui strongly implies, a relationship that is defined more in terms of friendship and affection is one that should, by its very nature, strive towards equity rather than power and abuse. If you want to find out more about radical heathen practice, head on over to onblackwings.com, where you can find articles, classes, resources, and more. This podcast was created and produced by Ryan Smith. Thanks for listening.